Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are tackling something that lands on your doorstep or maybe in your inbox every month and often causes, well, a fair bit of head-scratching, maybe even frustration. Your electricity bill. Specifically, we're zoning in on the structure of the APUA. That's the Antigua Public Utilities Authority electricity billing. Now, if you're the one looking at that statement each month, feeling like you need, a PhD in accounting and maybe global economics just to figure out the bottom line, trust me, you are not alone. That feeling is completely valid. Getting billed for electricity should be simple, right? You use power, you pay for it. But it often feels much more complicated than that. So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We want to cut through that complexity. We're aiming for a logical, step-by-step breakdown of how APUA structures its bills. We'll be highlighting exactly where some serious questions about transparency and, frankly, fairness start to pop up, especially around that one-line item that causes so much confusion, the fuel variation charge, or FVC.
We're hoping to give you the insights you need to really understand what you're paying for and, maybe more importantly, what crucial information seems to be, well, missing.
That really is the heart of it, isn't it? Information overload is one thing, but when the structure of a bill directly hits your household budget, clarity isn't just nice to have, it's essential. And when you have a situation like with a utility provider, which is often a monopoly, any lack of clarity, any opaqueness, it naturally breeds distrust. It makes people ask questions. So we've looked at a whole range of sources, news reports, some regulatory commentary, economic analyses of utility pricing. And what we're going to explore today is how the complexity you see might not just be accidental. We'll show how the lack of visibility into your basic usage patterns combined with a pricing mechanism like the FVC, which seems to work differently going up than coming down, how that structure can actually shift almost all the financial risk onto you, the consumer. We're going deeper than just the final number on the bill. We're looking under the hood at the machinery that calculates that number. Even before we look at a specific bill, we can see potential issues in the framework itself.
Okay, let's do that. Let's unpack the bill itself. Before we get into the controversies, the FEC and all that, let's just establish the basic building blocks. What are the typical line items someone sees on their APUA bill?
Right. It's good to lay the groundwork. Generally, you can break down the bill into maybe 5 main sections or components. And on the surface, this structure looks pretty similar to what you might see from utilities elsewhere in the world.
Seems standard enough.
It does. But the real devil, as they say, is often in the details, or perhaps more accurately here, in the lack of details or the hidden calculations behind those line items. That's where the trouble starts.
Okay, so first up, you've got the meter reading section. That's the starting point, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the raw data, essentially. Okay. It shows your previous reading, so the meter number from last month's bill, and then the current reading.
And the difference is your usage.
Exactly. Simple subtraction gives you the total kilowatt you consume during that billing period. This number, this kilowatt figure, it's fundamental. Everything else on the bill, all the charges, they flow directly from this one number.
Which means if that number is wrong,
then the whole bill is wrong. If there's an error in the reading, maybe the meter was misread, or maybe they had to estimate it for some reason, or the meter itself is faulty, then every single charge calculated afterwards is going to be off. It compounds the error right from the start.
Got it. Okay, moving on from the usage number, what's next? Usually the biggest chunk of the cost, right? The energy charge.
That's typically the case, yes. The energy charge is kind of the core revenue stream for the utility. It's a set base rate, a price charge for every single kilowatt you use.
And do we know what that rate generally is?
Well, our sources suggest it's often in the range of, say, EC $0.45 to EC $0.50 per kilowatt. Somewhere around there seems typical.
Okay, EC $0.45 to the $0.50 per unit of electricity. Now, you said this is the base rate. What's supposed to be covered by this particular charge? This is important for later, I think.
It's absolutely crucial. This base energy charge is designed, or at least it should be designed, to cover all the utilities' predictable, regular, ongoing costs of doing business.
Like what, specifically?
Think about everything needed to keep the lights on, literally. There's the huge capital investment, building power plants, putting up poles and wires, maintaining the grid, substations, all that infrastructure. Then you've got labor costs, administration, customer service, billing itself. There's depreciation on all that equipment.
And fuel. Does this base rate include the cost of fuel?
And critically, yes. It must include the fundamental baseline cost of the fuel needed to generate the electricity in the first place. Utilities usually plan for this. They might have longer-term contracts or forecast what the average fuel cost will be. That expected routine cost of fuel has to be factored into this base energy charge. Otherwise, the utility couldn't cover its basic operating expenses.
Right. So the standard predictable cost of fuel is already baked into that first main charge, the energy charge. Which brings us neatly to detail number 3. The fuel variation charge, often abbreviated as FVC. Now, if the base rate covers the normal fuel cost, what's this extra charge doing?
Good question. And this is where the complexity and the controversy really starts to build. The FVC is a separate line item, and importantly, it's also calculated per kilowatt it used. So you're paying the base rate per kilowatt hour, and you're paying the FVC per kilowatt hour on top of that.
Okay, so what's its official purpose then?
Officially, its purpose isn't to cover the routine cost of fuel, remember, that's supposed to be in the base rate. The FVC is meant to act as a kind of buffer or a hedge against market volatility. Its job is to capture the difference between that baseline fuel cost included in the energy charge and the actual potentially much higher cost the utility has to pay for fuel when global prices suddenly spike.
So if oil prices shoot up unexpectedly,
the FVC allows the utility to recover that unexpected extra cost from consumers so they don't suddenly face huge financial losses just because of global market swings they can't control. You could think of it as a volatility surcharge.
okay, a surcharge for unpredictable fuel price jumps. We'll definitely come back to dig into that one more. What else is on the bill? Detail 4.
Then you usually see Detail 4, which covers various other charges. Things like the environmental levy are common examples.
Are these usually significant?
Generally, no. These are often smaller charges, maybe fixed percentage amounts or small flat fees. They might be mandated by the government or specific regulations. While they add to the total, they're usually less contentious than something like the FVC, mainly because how they're calculated is usually fixed and public knowledge.
Less of a black box, maybe?
Exactly. Less opaque.
And finally, Detail 5. That's just the bottom line, right? Taxes in total.
Pretty much. It's the summation of everything. The energy charge amount, kilowatt use times base rate, plus the FVC amount, kilowatt use times FVC rate, plus any levies or other small adjustments, that gives you the total amount due.
So the blueprint seems clear enough on paper. You've got usage times a base rate, plus usage times a fuel surcharge, plus some smaller fees.
That's the structure, yes. But as we'll get into, the real problem isn't necessarily the structure itself, but the lack of transparency within certain parts of it, particularly how that FVC is calculated, and also the complete absence of detailed information about when you're actually using the electricity. That's what fundamentally undermines the perceived fairness of the whole thing.
Right. We have the structure laid out, but it sounds like the foundation, trusting the inputs and the calculations, is where things start to get shaky.
That's a good way to put it. The foundation needs to be solid, and right now, there are some serious cracks appearing when you look closely.
Okay, so let's shift from just defining the parts of the bill to what seems to be a core operational issue. Transparency. Specifically, transparency around your actual consumption. This feels like a really practical problem for anyone trying to manage their costs. The issue, as you mentioned, is the lack of visibility into when the electricity is being used during the month.
Precisely. This is a major point of divergence between, let's say, APUA's current practice and what's becoming standard in many other places, thanks to modern technology. The core problem is starkly simple. Your bill typically gives you just one number, the total kilowatt used over, say, 30 days.
A single lump sum.
A single lump sum. There are generally no breakdowns provided to you, the customer, showing how much you used day by day or even hour by hour. And this lack of granularity, this missing time dimension, it immediately throws up a huge barrier. It makes verification and efficient management almost impossible.
Let's break down why that missing timeline data is such a big deal. You mentioned it affects several critical things customers simply can't check. What's the first one?
The most basic one is verifying the meter reading itself. Factor 1. Were the meter readings estimated, or were they based on actual physical reads?
Why does that distinction matter so much?
Because estimation happens. Sometimes a meter reader can't get access, maybe there's a locked gate, a dog, whatever, or there might be an operational glitch, and the system generates an estimate based on your past usage history.
Okay, so estimates can happen.
They can. And while utilities are often supposed to indicate on the bill if it is an estimate, imagine your bill suddenly jumps significantly higher than usual. You look at it, you see the total kilowatt mo, but you have no daily data. How can you possibly tell if that total reflects your actual usage? or if it was just a potentially inaccurate projection.
Good point.
If you had a daily graph, maybe you'd see your usage was pretty normal for 28 days, but then there's this one massive, unexplained spike on day 29. Or maybe a day shows zero usage when you know you were home. That visual data gives you immediate grounds to question the utility. Hey, what happened on this day? Was the meter actually read, or did you estimate? Without that daily breakdown, you're basically forced to just trust the total number they give you. It makes any kind of personal audit incredibly difficult.
Right. You've got no reference points within the month.
Okay,
What's the second verification problem caused by this lack of data?
Factor 2 gets into managing your own usage patterns. Customers cannot identify which specific times or even which appliances are causing spikes in their consumption.
Explain that a bit more. I know I run my air conditioner, but...
Right, you use certain appliances, but electricity consumption isn't usually a flat line throughout the day or month. Maybe you have an older refrigerator that's become inefficient, or perhaps your pool pump is running longer than it needs to, or maybe, like you said, your AC unit is working overtime during the hottest part of the afternoon, say between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. every single weekday.
And that's drawing a lot more power.
Potentially, yes. But if all you see is the total kilowatt for the entire month, you can't pinpoint that specific energy hog or that particular time period where your usage skyrockets. You can't identify what's sometimes called a parasitic load, something drawing power unnecessarily. The difference between, say, running a big appliance for 1 hour versus 2 hours each day might seem small, but over a month, it adds up significantly. When you only see the final result, you have no way of knowing which specific behavior or appliance caused the high bill.
So you can't really manage your load factor effectively. Is that the idea?
That's a great way to put it. Load factor is basically about how efficiently you use power compared to your highest demand point. If you could see your usage on an hourly or even daily graph, you could potentially make conscious decisions to shift some of your energy use.
Like doing laundry late at night instead of during peak hours.
Exactly. Or running the dishwasher overnight. If you're unknowingly running multiple high-draw appliances, maybe the electric stove, the water heater, the AC, all at the same time during peak hours, say 5 p.m. to 8 p.m., you're creating a huge spike in demand. But without the data visualization to actually see that pattern happening, how can you possibly know to change it?
It's like driving blind, trying to save fuel without a fuel gauge.
That's a perfect analogy, which leads directly into the third major impact. Factor 3. Customers cannot reliably verify if their energy-saving habits are actually working.
This one feels really frustrating. Let's say I go out and spend a chunk of money. Maybe I replace all my old incandescent bulbs with efficient LEDs. I start being super careful about turning things off.
Right. You've made an effort, you've invested time, maybe money, and you're expecting to see a difference on your bill. The bill comes, and maybe it's a little lower. Or maybe it's roughly the same, perhaps because fuel costs went up that month, or it was hotter so the AC ran more, masking your savings.
So I'm left wondering, did those LEDs even make a difference? Was it worth the cost and effort?
Precisely. Because the total monthly kilowatt is such a blunt instrument, you can't directly correlate your specific action, like installing those LEDs, with a measurable drop in consumption on the days after you made the change. What you'd want to see is, say, your average daily usage dropping by X kilowatt starting the day after you installed the bulbs.
That would be clear proof.
It would be validation. Without that granular data, any attempt at proactive energy management becomes a frustrating guessing game. You make changes, but you don't get clear feedback on whether they're effective.
This really does sound, well, outdated compared to what's possible now. How do other utilities, maybe in the region or internationally, handle this? Is this APUA situation unusual?
It's becoming increasingly unusual, yes. It represents a significant limitation compared to the practices in many, many other jurisdictions. You look at places like Barbados, Trinidad, certainly most utilities in the US or Europe, they've largely moved towards smart metering technology.
Smart meters. We hear that term a lot. What does that actually mean for the consumer in practical terms? What information do they get?
Smart meters enable two-way communication between the meter and the utility, and crucially, they allow for the collection and sharing of detailed usage data. So customers in those areas typically get access to online portals or mobile apps provided by their utility.
And what did these portals show?
They show sophisticated usage analytics. We're talking about daily usage graphs, often hourly consumption charts. Some even provide near real-time data, maybe downloads in 15-minute intervals. So if your electricity usage suddenly spiked at 3 p.m. last Tuesday, you'd know it almost immediately. You could see the spike on the graph and start investigating what caused it right away.
So you could catch a problem quickly, like a faulty appliance.
Yeah.
Exactly. Maybe your water heater element failed and it's running constantly, or you accidentally left something switched on. With detailed data, you can perform your own mini audit, identify those unexpected energy draws, and correct the issue or change your behavior instantly instead of waiting up to a month to get a nasty surprise on your aggregated bill.
Okay, so beyond just the convenience factor, why is this lack of granular data such a critical issue for the listener, for the consumer?
Because fundamentally, your ability to manage your household budget effectively depends on having actionable information. Yes, you pay for the total kilowatt it consumed, but if you have zero visibility into how and when that consumption happens, you are effectively disempowered.
You can't control what you can't see.
Precisely. You can't track specific usage patterns tied to certain activities or appliances. You can't strategically shift your usage to potentially lower cost off-peak times if those exist. And crucially, you can't independently verify if the total kilowatt figure on your bill actually aligns with your lived experience and observable activities in your home.
It really raises a fundamental question of fairness, doesn't it?
It does. How can you rationally control your costs if the utility doesn't provide the basic information needed to understand when those costs are being incurred? The current system, with its lack of detailed analytics, makes informed consumption choices incredibly difficult, if not impossible. And that lack of control in the context of a regulated monopoly where you have no alternative provider feels fundamentally unfair.
All right, let's move on to the part of the bill that seems to generate the most heat, pardon the pun. The fuel variation charge, the FVC. This is where things get, as you said, really interesting, and where the economic structure of the bill starts to look, well, potentially problematic. Our sources, analysts looking at this, sometimes refer to it as a hidden double charge. That sounds pretty serious. Let's unpack that idea.
It is a serious critique, and understanding it requires us to go back to the two main components related to fuel costs that we talked about earlier. The core of the issue, as these analysts see it, is that you, the customer, appear to be paying for the cost of fuel in two different places on your bill.
Okay, remind us of those two places. Component number one was?
Component one is the cost of fuel that's already embedded within the base energy rate. Remember that EC dollars 45 or SIS dollars and 50 cents per kilowatt we discussed.
Right, the main charge.
We established that this base rate must cover the utility's routine, expected operational costs, and that includes the anticipated average cost of the fuel needed to run the generators. Let's just use a hypothetical number for clarity. Imagine that out of that $1.45 base rate, $6.20 is specifically budgeted to cover the normal expected cost of, say, heavy fuel oil based on the utilities forecasts and maybe long-term supply contracts.
So $6.20 per kilowatt for expected fuel cost is already in the main price.
Correct. That's the fixed recovery mechanism for fuel. It's built into the base price, ensuring the utility consistently recovers the fundamental cost of turning that fuel into the electricity you use.
Okay, fixed recovery in the base rate. But then component number two, the FEC, gets slapped on top of that base rate.
Exactly. The FEC is the variable recovery mechanism. It's layered on top, and it's also calculated per kilowatt. Its stated purpose, as we discussed, is to act like an escalator clause. If the actual price the utility has to pay for fuel on the global market jumps above that $1.20 baseline expectation.
So if fuel suddenly costs the equivalent of, say, 35 cents per kilowatt to buy instead of the expected $0.20,
then the FEC is supposed to kick in to recover that extra $1.15 difference.
Yeah.
$0.35 actual cost minus $0.20 expected cost. The idea is to protect the utility from taking a big loss due to that unforeseen price spike.
Okay, so the base rate covers the expected fuel cost. The FVC covers the unexpected extra cost when prices jump. Where does the double charge argument come in?
The argument stems from the fact that you're paying for the same underlying commodity fuel twice. Once as part of the predictable cost embedded in the base rate, and then again as a variable surcharge through the FEC when prices are high. You're essentially paying a base price and a premium for the same input.
But hang on, aren't fuel adjustment clauses like this pretty common for utilities worldwide? They need some way to handle volatile global fuel prices, don't they? Why is the APUA FEC structure seen as particularly flawed compared to others?
That's a fair point. Variable fuel charges are common. The criticism hinges on a crucial aspect, economic asymmetry. It's what some analysts call the drop problem.
The drop problem. Okay, explain that.
For an FVC mechanism to be truly transparent and fair, it really should work symmetrically, like a mirror image. If it's designed to go up quickly and automatically to recover additional costs when global fuel prices spike,
Then it should come down just as quickly and automatically when global fuel prices fall.
exactly, it should decrease proportionally when fuel gets cheaper. And logically, if global fuel prices were to fall significantly below the baseline cost that's already baked into the main energy charge, that $1.20 in our example, a truly symmetrical FVC should actually become a negative number. It should result in a credit back to the consumer on their bill.
A credit. So the utility would actually pay us back if fuel got really cheap.
In a perfectly symmetrical, purely pass-through system, yes. If the utility budgeted $0.20 for fuel in the base rate, but they only ended up paying $0.10 for it because global prices crashed, that $0.10 difference should theoretically be returned to the consumer via a negative FVC.
Okay, that makes sense logically, but what does the source material, the analysis we've seen, suggest is actually happening with the FVC in practice? Does it drop reliably?
Well, the strong suggestion from the critiques we've reviewed is that the FVC demonstrates, let's call it a sticky downward behavior. It shows a stubborn resistance to dropping proportionally or quickly when global fuel prices fall.
So it goes up easily when prices rise, but it doesn't come down as easily when prices fall.
That seems to be the core criticism. The mechanism appears highly responsive, perhaps quite quickly, to price increases, allowing the utility to recover costs swiftly. But it seems far less responsive, maybe much slower, or perhaps it doesn't fall as far when prices decrease.
That lack of symmetry sounds potentially advantageous for the utility.
It certainly does. This apparent asymmetry means that even during periods when the utility might be buying fuel on the world market at prices significantly below their historical average or below the price assumed in the base rate, the FVC charge on your bill often remains elevated or doesn't fall as much as you'd expect based on global trends.
So if the charge doesn't reliably drop when the utility's fuel costs go down, what's the bottom line implication for the utility and for the consumer?
The implication is pretty profound. Economically speaking, if the FVC rate stays high or only drops slowly even when global oil prices are low, it starts acting purely as a cost recovery mechanism.
It
starts functioning more like a source of additional, potentially quite stable profit margin for the utility. Profit that's disguised as a necessary adjustment for market volatility. It essentially allows the utility to benefit from the lag time between when global prices drop and when or if that saving is passed on to the consumer through the FVC. Think about the risk transfer. The utility has effectively used the FVC to shield itself from the upside risk of high fuel prices passing those costs directly to you. But if the mechanism isn't symmetrical, they may not be passing the full benefit of the downside risk, low fuel prices, back to you with the same efficiency.
So the consumer bears the brunt of high prices, but doesn't fully reap the reward of low prices.
That's the essence of the critique. Without a transparent, mandated formula forcing the FVC down promptly and proportionally, there's arguably a built-in financial incentive for the utility to keep the FVC higher for longer. The consumer keeps paying a premium related to fuel, even when the global market conditions suggest that premiums should be shrinking, disappearing, or even becoming a credit.
That hidden asymmetry, that drop problem, that's why analysts label it a potential hidden double charge.
Yes, because you're paying the utility's baseline cost of fuel in the energy rate, and you're potentially paying an additional charge via the FVC that might not accurately reflect the current difference between baseline and actual costs, especially when actual costs are falling. You're paying them to hedge against market risk, but you might not be getting the full benefit when that risk subsides or reverses.
Wow. Okay, that definitely makes the structure seem less like a simple pass-through and potentially more like something designed to protect utility revenue, perhaps even at the expense of consumer savings when fuel gets cheaper.
It certainly raises serious questions, particularly about regulatory oversight. If a charge is truly meant to be just a pass-through of costs, the entity imposing the charge usually has a responsibility to demonstrate transparently that it works both ways up and down. When you look at historical data for, say, the price of heavy fuel oil or diesel used in power generation, those prices fluctuate, sometimes dramatically. If you were to chart the global commodity cost over a year and saw it drop by, say, 30%, but the FVC rate on consumer bills remained largely flat or only dipped slightly over that same period, well, that discrepancy would strongly suggest the mechanism isn't functioning as a pure symmetrical pass-through. It implies funds are being collected via the FVC that exceed the actual current difference between the utility's fuel cost and the baseline cost already covered in the energy rate.
Okay, this leads us directly to the next major issue. If the FEC is supposed to be a legitimate market-driven charge reflecting actual fuel cost fluctuations, then logically the math behind it should be open to scrutiny, right? Consumers should, at least in theory, be able to verify it.
Absolutely. In a transparent system, you'd expect to be able to see the inputs, see the formula, and understand how the final number on your bill was reached.
But as we've hinted, a huge problem identified in our source material is the complete lack of published details needed to do that verification. It's like the key information is missing.
That's exactly right. The ability for an external party, whether it's an individual consumer, a consumer advocacy group, or even just an interested analyst to independently verify the FEC calculation is essentially zero. Why? Because the necessary inputs and the calculation method itself are not made public by APUA. This creates what we can call a verification void. It's an unbridgeable gap for the consumer trying to audit the charge.
Let's get specific about what's missing. What are the key pieces of information that aren't publicly available? You mentioned the formula itself first.
That's the most fundamental piece. How is the FEC actually calculated? What is the mathematical equation? You simply cannot check someone else's math if you don't know the formula they used.
It's like trying to check exam results without the answer key.
Or without even knowing what operation was performed. Was it addition, multiplication? Did they use calculus? We don't know. Without the formula, we don't know how the various inputs, like the price paid for fuel imports, the efficiency of the power plants, often called the heat rate, and maybe even the total kilowatt sales are combined to arrive at that final FEC rate per kilowatt that appears on your bill.
So you just have to take the number on faith.
Essentially, yes. You're compelled to accept the charge purely on the utility's assertion that it's correct. Think about it. If there were a simple error in their spreadsheet, or a mistake in applying the formula, even if the formula itself was sound, maybe an accidental typo, how would anyone outside the utility ever detect it? There's no mechanism for external validation without the formula.
Okay, no formula. What's the second missing piece you mentioned? Something about the fuel price.
Yes, this is also critically important for accountability. APUA doesn't publish the specific base fuel price it's using as its reference point for the calculation.
Why is naming the specific reference price so crucial?
Because the price of fuels isn't just one number. Which fuel are they talking about? Heavy fuel oil. Diesel, what grade? And crucially, which price index or source are they using? Are they referencing a global benchmark like Brent crude oil futures? Or are they using the specific CIF price that's cost, insurance, and freight, the actual landed cost of the fuel when the ship arrives in Antigua?
And does the timing matter? Like, are they using today's price or last month's?
Exactly. The time frame is vital too. Is the FEC based on the average price paid for fuel purchase 2 months ago, 3 months ago? That lag needs to be clearly defined. Without APUA specifying exactly which fuel product, which price reference, e.g. US dollars per barrel of West Texas Intermediate crude or the actual invoice cost of imported diesel, and for which time period they're using as the input for their FEC calculation, the consumer has absolutely no way to cross-reference it.
You can't check their input number against a known market price.
Precisely. You can't go look up a recognized international commodity price index and see if it matches what APUA claims it's basing the charge on. For all the consumer knows, the utility could potentially be using an outdated price or an inflated internal number or switching between different benchmarks depending on which one yields a higher FEC. Without that specific named reference point, independent auditing is impossible.
No formula, no specific reference price. What was the third missing element? Something about frequency.
Yes, the frequency of adjustments. How often does APUA recalculate and potentially change the FEC rate on bills?
Why does the adjustment frequency matter so much?
It matters enormously, especially in relation to that drop problem we discussed. Transparency demands that the utility clearly state its adjustment cycle. Is the FEC recalculated weekly, monthly, quarterly, maybe even less frequently?
Let's think about the impacts. Say global fuel prices take a sharp, sustained nosedive today.
Okay, good scenario. If APUA only adjusts its FEC rate on a quarterly basis, what does that mean? It means that even though the utility might start benefiting from significantly lower fuel costs almost immediately, you, the consumer, could remain locked into paying the previously higher FEC rate for potentially weeks or even months until the next scheduled adjustment date arrives.
So the lag time benefits the utility when prices fall.
That's the concern. A longer lag time, especially when combined with the lack of transparency around the formula and the base price, effectively worsens the drop problem. The less frequently they adjust downwards, the longer the utility potentially collects revenue based on older, higher fuel costs, even after their actual current costs have decreased. Prompt adjustment is key to fairness.
Okay, so this verification void, no formula, no specific price, no clear adjustment frequency. Let's connect that directly to consumer trust and fairness. What's the immediate consequence of APUA not disclosing this information, especially if, as you say, other utilities often do?
The immediate consequence is really a breakdown in the expected standard for a regulated monopoly. Without this public disclosure, the FEC charge becomes inherently suspicious because it's impossible for anyone outside the utility to objectively scrutinize it. It's like saying, trust us, the amount is correct, without showing any of the working.
Which naturally erodes trust.
It inevitably erodes consumer trust, yes. But it also presents a significant challenge from a regulatory perspective. If the public or consumer groups or even economic watchdogs cannot access the basic input data and the calculation method, how effectively can anyone, including potentially the official regulator, provide meaningful oversight of this charge? It makes true independent auditing extremely difficult, if not impossible, without demanding access to proprietary internal company documents, which isn't practical for the average person.
You mentioned industry standards elsewhere. Can you give an example of how a more transparent utility handles this?
Sure. In many jurisdictions with well-established regulatory frameworks, utilities are often required by law or regulation to publish a clear, standardized fuel price adjustment formula. It's publicly available.
So everyone knows the math.
Everyone knows the math. And they usually have to specify the exact base fuel price used in that formula, the specific market index they reference, like a particular oil price benchmark, and the precise calculation methodology. Some utilities even publish regular reports, maybe monthly, that explicitly show the previous period's average fuel cost, plug that number into the public formula, show the resulting calculations step by step, and clearly state the new FEC rate that will be effective for the upcoming billing cycle.
Wow, that sounds like night and day in terms of transparency.
It really is. That kind of proactive disclosure turns what could be a complex and opaque charge into a verifiable public accounting exercise. Anyone can take the published fuel price data, use the published formula, and check the utility's math.
Why does that level of transparency exist in those places? What's the underlying principle?
The underlying principle goes back to the nature of a utility, especially a monopoly. You, the listener, you can't just decide to switch to a different electricity provider if you're unhappy with APUA's prices or practices. You have no choice.
Right, they're the only game in town.
Exactly. And because of that captured market position, the utility operates under a kind of unique social contract. That contract implies a much higher obligation for transparency and accountability than you might expect from a regular competitive business. When essential information, like how a major charge is calculated, is kept hidden, it fundamentally undermines the basis of that trust and fairness.
So the FEC, without a public formula or verifiable inputs,
it effectively starts to look less like a regulated utility charge and more like a kind of private tax on consumption, where the rate is dictated solely by the entity collecting it, without clear external justification. That's why the scrutiny is so intense, and why the demands for transparency around the FEC are so persistent. The lack of verifiable inputs allows the perception, and perhaps the reality to continue, that the FEC might be functioning more as a discretionary revenue-enhancing tool than as a purely objective cost recovery mechanism. Hashtag outros.
Okay, so this deep dive has taken us through the structure of a typical APUA electricity bill, but more importantly, it's really highlighted some significant areas of concern regarding transparency and the ability for you, the consumer, to verify what you're paying for. Based on the source material and analysis we've looked at, we've essentially identified three primary issues.
That's right. Issue number one is that fundamental lack of usage analytics. No daily or hourly data means you can't easily verify meter readings, you can't pinpoint when you're using the most energy, and critically, you can't get clear feedback on whether your efforts to save energy are actually paying off. As we said, you simply can't manage what you can't measure.
Then issue number two, the big one perhaps, is the fuel variation charge, FVC itself. The analysis we've seen suggests it potentially operates as a hidden double charge for fuel. You pay for fuel on the base rate, and again via the FVC. And crucially, there's that drop problem. The charge doesn't seem to decrease reliably or symmetrically when global fuel prices fall.
And that leads directly to issue number three, the verification void. The complete absence of a publicly available FVC formula, the lack of a clearly defined reference fuel price, and no stated adjustment frequency. This information blackout means the FEC rate is entirely unverifiable by consumers, making it appear arbitrary and shielding it from effective external oversight.
So the core conclusion seems to be that your ability as a well-informed customer to actually manage your electricity consumption is hampered by the missing hourly data. And at the same time, your ability to verify the fairness of the charges, particularly the FEC, is blocked by the hidden math.
Exactly. The system, as it appears to be structured based on these analyses, seems to place almost all the risk of volatile fuel prices squarely onto your shoulders, the consumer, while simultaneously denying you the very information you would need to audit whether the utility is managing and passing through those costs fairly and symmetrically.
It leaves the consumer in a very difficult position.
It does, and that brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over after this deep dive. If the entire stated rationale, the sole justification given for having a fuel variation charge, is the need to recover costs driven by volatile global fuel prices, then what specific regulatory and, frankly, ethical responsibility does the utility have to demonstrate, not just assert, but clearly show with verifiable data and transparent methodology that this charge fluctuates downwards to provide relief to consumers just as reliably, just as quickly, and just as transparently as it fluctuates upwards to ensure the utility recovers its costs? That asymmetry we discussed, the potential difference in the speed and magnitude of the upward adjustments versus the downward adjustments, that lingering question about true symmetry is perhaps the biggest puzzle still sitting at the heart of this electricity billing structure. Something for you to think about.